Some basic steps to do after the install and configuration is all set up. You can get the status of any of the services individually just by running service, status name, status. For Kafka, you should expect to see both Kafka and Zookeeper running in the single node Kafka setup. You can jump over to NetOps portal on the system health page, the status page in NetOps portal. You'll find an OI connector section. If you see an orange state, that means degraded. There's a green and red. Red would be bad. Red would be a serious problem with the connector. Here you can see that the health is degraded. There's a description about the inventory task taking longer than expected. So if a task takes longer than a certain percentage of the amount of time we allocate for that task, that'll put it in a degraded state. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's not working. It just means things are slowing down or things are not running as optimally as they should. Recommend checking the logs for errors, especially after install and it's been running for a minute or two. The log files are all in the connector home install directory under logs. The core service logs to OI connector.log. You can grep that for error, capital error, and look for errors in that log. Typically, the kinds of things you'll see after install that are not working are authentication. Maybe you provided a bad password for the NetOps portal credentials, or maybe the token to OI is not right. Something like that. You'll see authentication errors in the logs. Those would be typical. We're going to want to look for performance metric flow. One thing to note though with this is it takes a while for metrics to start flowing, and that's because internally what we have to do is first harvest all the information about an inventory item before we can actually register the metric. And then once we register the metric, then we can start to flow the metrics, the actual metric values on that metric. So it can take several poll cycles. So if a poll cycle is 5 minutes typically for PM, it can take several cycles until after we see the first metric from that family on that inventory item. It can take several poll cycles for it to actually start sending the data. Now the good news is once we've done this registration, it's cached so that if you restart the connector, we don't have to wait those cycles anymore. We can immediately send. But just know that you shouldn't expect to run the connector and immediately go over to OI and start seeing metrics seconds later. It's going to take a couple cycles for it to run to get all this done. And if your poll cycle is 15 minutes, well, that's just going to increase the amount of startup time it needs because we do these things when we receive the metrics. And so if it's 15 minutes, that just means it's taking longer to get all this harvesting done. But what you'll see in the log, and we recommend you can grep for this client summary, this is going to show how many metrics. NAS is the metric store of OI. You'll see how many were successfully sent in the last 5 minutes. So each time we spit out this section of log, it's a 5-minute interval. And so you can see in this case it was 7.2 million metrics were sent in that 5-minute period. There were no failures or retries. There were no metric registrations because we've already registered all the metrics. So in an initial startup, you'll see there'll be far more registrations than there will be metric ingestion. But over time, the registrations will go down to 0 and the ingestion will go way up because now everything's registered and we're sending metrics. This is the reason why that the multiple cycle in terms of how long it takes us to start flowing metrics. I don't know how much detail we should go in here, but we get a metric. If the inventory item is cached, then, or if it's not cached, we have to drop the value. We have to wait for it to be cached in inventory. So there's open API queries happening to kind of harvest all the metadata about an inventory item, and we can't send metrics until we have all of that metadata. And so, again, this is every 5 minutes we're getting a metric typically from PM. If the inventory item is not cached, we're dropping it until we get that inventory cached. Once it is, if it's registered in OI already, we have a metric registration, we can send it immediately. If it's not, we drop the value and register it, and then the next time we get the metric, at that point we should have a clear shot to be sending the metrics. So each failure in here, each time it goes down a no path, we're waiting on the next metric harvest for that inventory item for that metric. So each time would be a poll cycle. So that just maybe helps understand why it takes a little bit of time. Again, once the connector, once everything's cached, um, this process is much faster because things are in the cache already. We don't have to wait. All right, some troubleshooting stuff here. So we're not seeing performance metrics in OI. This is, probably the biggest one that we get. I guess starting from the top is make sure NetOps is actually collecting the metrics that you're expecting. So even ignoring OI, is NetOps collecting that metric? Have you waited long enough? That gets to what we just talked about. What's the status of the connector in the NetOps portal system health page? If you see a status that says degraded and that it's not keeping up or falling behind in terms of metrics, um, that's usually a sign that you're under resourced, that you need more heap. Is Kafka Zookeeper running? Again, if it's our Kafka we installed, you can check that with that service Kafka status command. Is the DA metric export configured? Remember that step after install, you have to enable it to turn on the metric flow and point it to your Kafka broker or cluster. So is that configured? If you had the Kafka broker host name or port incorrectly set, you may need to toggle this state of the export to be off, save the file, and then come in and turn it back on to have it recognize a change. So if you change the broker host name and port, you might need to toggle the metric export state. Within NetOps portal, there's a OI global collection that is used to control the metrics that are exported. So we should look and see if that global collection exists. And then always, are there any error messages in the log related to failures? That could even, it could be a bad gateway token. The security token might not be right. The cohort, the OI tenant ID, cohort ID might be wrong. So looking for errors in the log is always a good move. If you're not seeing metrics from a specific metric family, um, there's probably an error or a problem with the configuration in that config XML. Again, it's Spring Bean config, so it could be easy to make a mistake in there. So that would be the place to check. As I mentioned, only 5 metric families are set up to export by default. So is your metric family in that list? Are we excluding out? There's that metric include filter property that said which metrics get exported from a family. There's only 7 or 8 from port that are currently configured out of the box, so perhaps it's not in those. So if your metric family is not listed, then as we mentioned, you'll need to add a section and configure that new metric family. And you can always ask for help if you need it in that area. Okay. If you're not seeing performance monitored inventory, we want to, again, check the log for errors. In this case, you'll be looking for errors related to TAS ingestion. TAS is the topology store within OI, and so you'll find error messages related to TAS ingestion, which would explain why you wouldn't see inventory. You can verify that the expected inventory is contained within that OI seed group. Perhaps it's being filtered out based on the rule that's in that seed group. If you see group ingestion failures, where you're not seeing the CAPM defined groups within OI, again, check for logs in the error related to Jarvis ingestion. So groups are typically stored in Jarvis as well as TAS. And so you'll, again, just grepping for error in the OI connector log is probably your best friend here. If the connector can't connect to portal, NetOps portal, especially on startup, we try to query NetOps portal for the version. If that REST call fails, the connector will shut down immediately. And that's usually an authentication problem. Confirm that the login user and password that you used to set up the connector is still working. Can you still log into NetOps portal with that password credential? If it's changed, then you need to actually update the credentials in the config XML. Currently, we store that password as base64 encoded string. Um, there are plenty of utilities to create a new base64 encoded string, so if you need to update that, you can either reinstall the connector or you can simply do a base64 encoding yourself and put it in there. Just a note, the next release of the connector will actually have an additional layer of security here, and these things will also be encrypted, and you'll have to run an encryption tool to get the encrypted version of the encoded string to put here. But you don't have to worry about that yet, and that'll be in the next release of the connector. As I mentioned, if you're using NetOps 21.2.1 or higher, then you need a newer version of the connector. You need 2.1.2 because of the increased security and credentials required to authenticate. If your connection is being proxied, so look at there's a slide up ahead here on proxy server troubleshooting. You probably want to not proxy the connection between the connector and NetOps portal. If the connector is shutting down unexpectedly, you'll find errors in the wrapper log related to running out of heap. I would again go back and verify that the memory allocated is appropriate. Perhaps you're monitoring more inventory now than when the connector was first configured, and you need to give it more heap. That heap is configured in the wrapper.conf file, and there's an initial Java heap size and a max size. Okay, if there's an issue in OI where metrics are reflected with an old name, IP, or metadata, I mentioned earlier that we cache that stuff so that we don't have to re-register it every time the connector is restarted. But there could be a situation where a device gets kind of reconfigured, such that now that cached information is no longer valid. You can manually remove the metric cache from the connector, and there are files that end in .ser in the conf directory. If you remove those files and restart the connector, that will force a re-registration of all of that metric metadata. Configuring a proxy can sometimes be a challenge. They can manifest issues in connections to any of the key pieces here, whether it's NetOps portal, the data aggregator, Kafka, or OI. You want to confirm a couple things in the configuration file where that information is stored. I've listed it here. It's java.conf. I would make sure that portal, the DA, Kafka hosts are listed in the non-proxy hosts config. Check logs on the proxy server. A proxy server will usually logs errors and traffic. We can look at those logs sometimes to get some clues what's going on. If you've configured using HTTPS in the proxy config, I would ask whether that's really necessary. We've seen where folks have configured HTTPS and it really wasn't required. So I generally say try with just HTTP and again using the credentials. Same note here on the base64 credentials here. Again, that's part of future security encryption that will be happening. There are some known limitations with the connector. We don't have a smooth upgrade process. We generally recommend you back up the connector configuration directory, and this is for reference in case you need anything there. And then it's an uninstall, reinstall of the connector basically. And you can use the information in the conf folder if you need to refer back to any custom changes that were made. But unfortunately right now it is an uninstall, reinstall process to upgrade the connector, and it is on the roadmap for something that we need to address, obviously. If you have non-PM monitored inventory, so inventory that only NFA say is monitoring, that inventory won't be delivered to OI. So basically we need to make sure that everything is also discovered with PM as well. There's also a documentation section that has some known limitations that you can look at.